afternoon, and welcome to the Cloud Service Provider's Multi-Cloud Network Design webinar, hosted by Macronet Services. I'm your host, Gary Sloper, co-founder and managing partner of Macronet Services, and I wanted to take this time to say thank you for joining us today. We have a very short webinar. I promise to keep it under 30 minutes. That's my goal. We realize that everyone is webinar fatigued, but the objectives of this webinar today is really to go over just debunking some of the myths in terms of connecting into a multi-cloud strategy. And essentially what we wanted to do is kind of walk through some of these scenarios that we see on a daily basis. So if you think about the background of where multi-cloud adoption has now sprung up in a lot of our organizations and what that means, but you really have to understand the history of how we got here today to connect these networks. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then critical architecture planning. So how do you go about really looking at your multi-cloud strategy and connecting not only the data centers together where these two clouds reside, but also the proximity of your users and your company personnel that need to access the resources in this multi-cloud environment. So it may not just necessarily be two IaaS providers, it could be two SaaS providers or multiple SaaS entities that you are trying to connect into. So we'll talk a little bit about how to approach that and really what that high availability design looks like, especially from an N+1 perspective. Very easy to do between data centers, a little bit more difficult to do as you ride a public backbone or even a private backbone through various carriers. And then how do you go about solving that challenge? And we'll really talk about how we solve this today within our existing customers. When we kind of think about the traditional internet here in the United States, we support customers globally, but today's conversation will just focus narrowly on the US just because it'll allow us to do a shorter demo and a shorter webinar. But if you think about the United States, here's a great picture of a rail car that was built by Phil Anschutz, who is a leading entrepreneur, still is today, and has a storied history in terms of being innovative in thinking well in advance of what is needed in the global marketplace. So this was a rail car built in the mid-90s to plow conduit on either side of the right-of-ways along the railroad. So he owned a lot of the tracks throughout the United States, and he saw the growing demand of bandwidth. Now, at this time, a lot of folks, including myself, are probably using more dial-up in our residences. It wasn't as much broadband, but he saw the need of an eventual bandwidth glut that would ultimately come about. So he went and he built two conduits on either side, what his organization did, on either side of the railroads, and below the frost line, so about 48 inches below the frost line, there was at least one conduit on either side of those four that carried fiber. One conduit was left open in case future technology was developed, so you could pull newer technology of fiber through those conduits. So thinking very, very far ahead. So he built this OC192 backbone. And why this is important today for your cloud design, we'll just talk about here in the US, is that a lot of times there are multiple carriers in play that you're trying to be diverse from. As you're trying to connect, data centers or have your users or your private connections into these multi-cloud environments. What a lot of organizations that don't understand how this topology originally was created is that oftentimes some of these routes are in the same conduit. So while it'll be separate equipment on the carrier side, but you can see that some of these fibers were actually sold or kind of merged together since the 90s as one company. So you may be on separate devices, you may be in separate POPs potentially, but most likely you're traditionally routing some of these same conduits. So that is not something that you can publicly really understand, but we'll talk a little bit about how we look at that at a very high level macro view in terms of what that long haul looks like, and then what the spurs look like coming off from a metro standpoint. But if you think about it, some of this fiber was originally GTE, that became Verizon. Quest was kind of the construction company that built these right-of-ways, and they became a global backbone provider, but they were basically merged into CenturyLink. CenturyLink merged into Level 3. Level 3 had some fibers here. So when you start looking at it, all ends up almost looking like one company, and that can be very daunting as you start to look at your multi-cloud environment. So what I always do, and what we typically focus on when we sit down with a customer, is let's go through just a high-level checklist. So first and foremost, you want to understand where your cloud zones are. So we'll show how we do that very quickly. And then what are the route options to each zone? So clearly you want to connect multiple clouds together, most likely from an app and database tier, or even if it's, some sort of redundancy option or it's test and dev, but most likely those need to connect. So how do you go about doing that? And then if you want to connect from a metro perspective, how do you go about that planning piece? Because there are so many vendors to look at. And then as you start to figure all this out, what are the deployment schedules of each? So if you are utilizing a software-defined approach between data centers, those can turn up very, very quickly, within minutes, most likely, as long as you have your cloud configurations ready to go on the fabric side. But when you start talking about long-haul networks, that's where it becomes very difficult to really plan in advance. And then understanding the deployment zones within each cloud. We'll talk about the nomenclature and how their fabrics at a high level are very different. So there's no one set standard. So you really need to understand those varying environments. And then the last piece that we always talk to customers about is governance, governance, governance. You really want to make sure that you truly have a good understanding of your environment, because you're going to have multiple providers in play. And that's one of the things that we often manage for customers, is managing those relationships, the billing, the SLAs, and also the design as one-stop shop. So this comes into play because as we think of traditional MPLS environments, a lot of customers are now moving away from a traditional, closed user group VPN that they've built with an MPLS network. And it was always great, right? So you had a traditional IP core, you had core routers and edge routers that carried your traffic and built private VRFs across the global backbone that you might have built, or even just here in the US. And that allowed you to use technologies like fast reroute, which was great, especially if there was a failure. So you basically have two label switch paths nailed up well in advance, and you could reroute over those, and you didn't really have to do a whole lot. The carrier took care of that. Well, why this all kind of intertwines, especially from a governance standpoint, is now that companies are potentially moving away from a pure MPLS environment and moving that more into an integrated SD-WAN environment, where they may have MPLS links, but most likely they're using public IP broadband. You really need to understand how to govern that transition. And now you could potentially have multiple carriers in an environment. Just recently, I was working with a customer. They had 38 public carriers in their environment. They had a non-MPLS topology. It was more of a public environment. But think about that, 38 carriers that you have to manage, and then also connect into a multi-cloud strategy. So there's a lot of great things that have occurred over the years, but even just from an MPLS perspective, that was really nice and designed well, especially from a QoS standpoint. So when you wanted to deliver those high quality voice conversations and video tracks, very, very great for a low latency type of queuing environment within QoS. So think of like the prioritization that Cisco would typically utilize in some of these types of environments. That's great. But now if you think about today in a more of a distributed fashion, some of those voice calls don't necessarily need to go over your private network. There's plenty of cloud voice providers that are handling some of those services. So now you've got this network that could be potentially hairpinning different services unnecessarily. So this was great. And then as we kind of move into kind of the next generation, we start hearing customers say, all right, I have some sort of connectivity of something. How do I make this network or my future network move into a multi-cloud strategy? And not necessarily having two IaaS providers. Sometimes it's just multi-cloud from a SaaS standpoint. They want to take advantage of SaaS utilization of resources. So what are my API requirements that I could connect into a Salesforce or a Zscaler or some of these other types of SaaS environments that do different things for my company or my end customers? And so when you have this, I wouldn't say necessarily technology debt, but prior connectivity resources that you want to continue to use in this new environment, it can be very difficult to untangle that. Or if as you're coming end of your contract, how do you basically wipe the slate clean? So what I always explain to customers, if we're talking about IaaS, for example, and that's where a lot of multi-cloud really is from an IaaS standpoint, having one provider providing one type of service, maybe the app tier, and like I mentioned before, another service maybe providing the database tier. Really need to understand how they're all talking in that language. And what I mean by that is their connection fabric themselves. Many of you are familiar with the direct connect option here with Amazon, but not everybody's familiar with the direct link within IBM. And that could be because not necessarily using IBM, or a lot of their test environment just automatically goes to AWS. But we're definitely seeing more environments now where customers want to use other resources, namely like an Oracle Cloud. They want to take advantage of connecting into, maybe an autonomous environment. So there's a lot of reasons to have multi-cloud, and I think we'll continue to see that with still having data center space. There's a lot of customers that are still migrating between data centers, downgrading or upgrading their footprint for whatever reason. It could be compliance. It could be there's workloads that they just need to maintain in their own environment. Or it could just be these applications will never be cloud ready, but they're important for some sort of use case within our business. And so as you think about all these things, the huge opportunity from a multi-cloud standpoint is that you still have the ability to move quickly. You can go into different proximity zones and still have those legacy architectures or those legacy types of environments like co-location still play. But you really need to understand, what is available to you specifically as the consuming entity for your organization. The weakness is that they all have, their own network considerations, meaning to connect into some of these clouds from a traditional carrier perspective, they've designed different services with each cloud. So some may actually bring an MPLS circuit into their cloud fabric to connect into you and Amazon or an Oracle or an Azure. And some may only have a, physical layer one point-to-point wavelength that comes into your environment. So you really need to understand that as you're having these conversations. So what we do is we try to remove a lot of that mystery, because we often get the question, Houston, I have a problem. Like, I need to move quickly, and cloud moves quickly. I can spin up an environment within minutes, but I can't move my telco. I can't move my carrier environment that's spread across the ether. I can't rip copper and fiber out of the ground. So what do I do? How do I connect in here? So what's the best bet? So the two main questions that often come about is, how do I connect my multi-cloud environments just between each other first? And then how do I take my customers and my office internal consumers into that cloud? So here is a prime example that we see regularly, which is I'm going to continue within my Amazon environment, but I do want to spin up a cloud environment in Oracle. How do I connect there? What is the latency? I need to make sure that I do this correctly before I even start to push instances into the cloud. And so that, very quickly is something that's extremely common. You can take that software-defined fabric that exists within these data centers. So there's software-defined specific providers that exist today that we partner with to basically deliver that high availability environment, or just a single path between those locations. They're actually separate from the traditional telco carrier. It could be a software-defined specific provider. It could be the actual data center that these cloud environments are in, so they all have their own private fabric. And then there are some carriers that have built an SD-WAN environment that could commingle with your current SD-WAN environment. So it's just simply dropping a couple additional SD-WAN instances together. But that sounds super easy. What's extremely difficult is understanding the fabric within each one of these cloud environments. So you can see here, we're talking about the AWS and Oracle deployment, but you really have to understand how Direct Connect interfaces with Fast Connect, which is the Oracle fabric. And there's incredible amount of documentation, but what doesn't exist for you as a user is to, based on your specific use case, how to concretely do this very quickly. And so we take a lot of that documentation and we make it down into a consumable architectural discussion to say, here is the best option. It looks like this, it looks like this, or it looks like this. And we walk customers through it, because it quite simply could just be a software-defined fabric connection between the two locations. However, it all depends on how you're actually connecting to these environments today with your users and, again, your internal office consumers. So when we sit down with customers, we try to build out that logical environment, but the main thing we want to do is kind of plan the plumbing first. So we start to go through kind of a checklist of how many cloud interconnects and in what regions. So it may seem obvious to us on here on the call today, but there's many times where a customer says, yes, I'm deployed in AWS West, and everybody comes to me that way. Well, that's great. But do you have compliance requirements from the EU, for example, internationally, to backhaul all of that user data across the pond, across the US, and to that West location? So not only do you have to worry about latency, but you have to worry about compliance in those types of data environments. So we talk about that. We talk about what other instances could exist to make some of your life a little bit easier. So you can go back to your cloud service providers and have a different conversation, but we can pre-build some of those designs in advance so you already understand kind of what the high level latency would be, what the deployment schedule would look like, and so forth. The other thing is, what is your SLA requirements for you internally and also your customers? How are you going to implement this? So do you plan on turning this up on your own? Do you have individual partners that you work with? Or just from a design perspective, have you thought about all the different providers that will go into play? And I'll show you what that looks like shortly. And then, a lot of customers will come to me and say, I want that high availability design between my two clouds. That's great, and it's actually very easy to do and very cost effective. Where it becomes very difficult, again, if you think about that rail car that originally built out the network here in the United States, well, if there wasn't a tremendous amount of rail capacity in certain parts of the US, most likely there isn't the same type of fiber options. So as you look to do diverse connections, you still could be within that same conduit that we saw earlier, or you could be routed to another part of the US, which adds additional latency but also cost. So when I have these conversations with customers, I really need to understand what is their high availability expectations. We're actually going to be doing a webinar on this because there's still a lot of misconceptions around just routing diversity, whether it's within cloud or it's within a traditional software-defined network. A lot of folks feel, well, I go to a different POP, but they don't realize they're at a the same wiring center, the same central office within the same conduit. So some of your high availability actually goes away, and you're most likely paying a higher rate for something that you're not necessarily going to achieve unless you're okay with taking some of those risks. So that's part of our analysis that we do. So then what we do is we try to map out your desired topology. So I'll actually show you here what we'll do within our tool set. Try to locate the nearest regions based on the users that need to access your environment. So from a CSP perspective, if your users are coming from some other part of the world or the United States or a region, how is that playing into where your second cloud will actually reside and what the RTT would look like between those locations. And then we look at vendor options. So we are an unbiased organization, so you'll see that we have many options to help you with. We do utilize as many on-net options as possible because that keeps the cost down. But then there's sometimes that those on-net options are not necessarily the best performing ones in that particular region. So we may have to look at something that's off-net, kind of a type 2 environment. And then we try to competitively price this for you so that way when you do negotiate these contracts with your vendors, you understand kind of holistically how it will work from A to B. The challenge that you'll find is as you're cobbling together different connectivity options from a CSP perspective, basically connecting those two clouds, your users and your organization to communicate in, not all the organizations will work together. It's unfair for your CSP to say, yeah, I'm going to go help you build a circuit all the way from my location to England with your carrier. That's not part of their responsibility, and they most likely won't have the expertise or the time to go do that. So that's where we kind of play that liaison from an advisor standpoint because we've done so many of these designs. So what I'd like to do is just quickly shift screens here. And I think what would be interesting is if we, briefly just showed a little bit of some of the tooling that will help customers with. So right here, we have a, let me just shut this off so you don't get a little bit better of a screen. So what we have here is, quick map of the United States, what we talked about. And so as we start trying to think about overlays for customers, as they're starting to build out their cloud strategy, and if they already have AWS today, namely we can pull these locations up. What's important though, sometimes we have found instances where companies have felt that they knew where, say, an AWS location was or an Azure location, and it was close to their business case that they require, but unfortunately it was a government location, that they reserve for those types of clients. So this is a good way for us to just kind of overlay this. But what's also great too, as we start thinking about locations. So I always bring up, and if you saw my LinkedIn post, what they call data center alley, or I like to call data center playground. So if you go to, we'll just say the Ashburn, Virginia area, there's a tremendous amount of data centers here. And what's great about what we'll help customers with is based on where they plan to connect their multiple clouds together, or even a cloud to a data center location. We help a lot of customers with co-location, whether it's staying within a facility or helping them migrate to another facility to be closer to that cloud environment. They really need to understand what the Cloud Connect options are. So we're able to very quickly eliminate or include some of the options that exist. So if we're looking for those AWS Direct Connect locations, we can quickly filter, the various data centers that would exist. And that's important because as customers are thinking about maybe going into a location, they're certainly going to reach out to that account team or that engineer and say, do you have AWS Direct Connect? Do you have the Microsoft Azure Express Route? Do you have Oracle Fast Connect? But then as you start thinking about, where those data centers are, to be able to go through and have really concrete architectural discussions, you can see the various vendors that exist, and the locations that are there too. So it can be a little daunting, especially if you don't have this background. And if you don't have this background, it's not a fault on your side. And I always tell customers this: you're not necessarily deploying brand new multi-cloud environments with CSPs and migrating between data centers on a weekly basis. So it's unfair for us to expect that of you in the industry. We are doing this on a regular basis. So we know, even just with some of the tribal knowledge, the things that exist. So as I start looking at, there's other options that exist even from a fabric standpoint that we can also take a look at. So, for you to just feel that, oh, all right, I know AWS Direct Connect is here, there may be other faster and much more cost effective and also quicker options to implement that you're just unaware of based on what we see quite often. So we can go through this and we can kind of figure out what the data center tiers that we're looking for, or even some of the various certifications that a lot of data centers must have to support certain customers. But I love when I look at some of these locations, I love going to this kind of like metro here with Data Center Alley. It's always interesting because you can see how many different data centers exist. So if I think about just what exists in this location, and I think on my LinkedIn post I actually pulled up this Equinix location. So very quickly, as I'm looking at Equinix and this Filigree Court location, and in that environment, they have multiple data centers, which has various cloud providers there. But I can very easily see who's on net. So that definitely helps me quickly. The challenge that you have is, are you literally going to go have an individual conversation with all of these providers to get the best route, price, SLA, and contract terms for you as a third-party entity? Maybe, maybe not. I often find that most customers have dealt with a handful of these providers and know, what their strengths and weaknesses are, but they also are not necessarily privy to any of the investments that they've made over time and some of the product roadmaps that have helped enhance connecting to multiple CSPs. Conversely, they're not as familiar with some of the, the newer software-defined fabrics that exist to connect between data center assets. So this is where, I personally spend now 20 hours a month just training on, the various options across our portfolio, these items included, so that way we can provide a much, different architectural discussion, with you and for you. So if I think about, now we kind of know a little bit about the, the data center footprint. Now, if we moved over from a fiber tool perspective, this is where it gets a little bit interesting. So if we think about that United States again, and we think about the rail car that Phil Anschutz' organization had built, a lot of different railroads across the United States, but most likely, some of that backbone wasn't in every single state. And so we all know that there's corporations in every single state, and they all need to connect into CSPs of some sort, both for their own consumption, but also their partners' consumption. So if we were to look at that, I'll just pull up Filigree Court again. And we'll go back to Data Center Alley. And this is where a lot of clients start to get stumped. So here we've drilled down a little bit further than what you saw before. So before we covered, kind of what was on net, and it'll certainly pull it up here. And I can, quickly just verify, yep, okay, looks like a building. but more importantly, what really becomes fascinating to me is when a customer says, I'm going to go and grab a metro connection to connect into a long haul environment with, based on my cloud environment here in this filigree court location. I've done all my due diligence, and so I just ask questions. Where is it routing? And the reason why I ask that, and sometimes I get kind of a blank stare, this when I select these providers, it quickly looks like a kindergartner was pulling out the box of crayons and having fun trying to create their own lines to color within. But this can be very daunting for a lot of organizations. So as you start to try to build out what the proper approach would be to have route diversity or the best option leaving your facility across the long haul, this is where it can be very challenging. So if you were to try to explain to me, based on your chosen provider, if they're diverse from some of the others, it'd be very difficult to tell. Now we can certainly drill in, a little bit further, and you can get a little bit more granular, but then it starts getting a little bit more difficult. And part of the reason why is a lot of this is confidential. So some of you are astute. You understand that some carriers will give you a KMZ file if you're willing to sign one of the most lockdown NDAs that exist. And I've done this before when I've run solution engineering teams for carriers, but it can take some time, and it's not a quick process, and often they don't want to reveal some of those assets. So what we try to do is help customers identify what some of these may look like in advance. And the reason why we do that is, say if we were to go and look at I'll say Crown Castle and Zayo Metro. And so here I may have some options which could potentially be diverse. So as I go and I request some of my engineering design work, I know ahead of time kind of what I'm asking. If I see, conduit or say if I see a conduit request from a customer, I can certainly ask for that, because some of this may just actually be aerial. It's not necessarily everything is in a conduit. So customers have to understand that as well. So if you have something buried in the ground and aerial across telephone poles, that's great. If they're all coming on telephone poles and you have multiple carriers, and that teenager riding down the freeway crashes the car into that telephone pole, it's taking both providers out. It doesn't matter what kind of diversity you have. So these are the things you need to consider. And we could do this very quickly for customers and work back with our partners here, across all of these, different carrier networks. But see, the thing that you also have to understand is that's just simply only the metro environments. So if we talk about that long haul environment, long haul connectivity is a little bit more limited, but again, it's a long haul connectivity piece. So what I mean by that is you're not going to have as many providers, because when that rail car was built, there wasn't any, core spur that was coming off of this location onto the railroad network that made sense to go and build those right of ways. So a lot of this construction happened because of the need, most likely the need because there was so many data centers and many customers need to be down here. And this part of the country has some of the largest BGP route reflectors across the global internet. So these are the things that kind of existed that caused some of the construction. But now if I think about, as I'm starting to really get outside of, this Virginia area and ultimately this part of, the United States, as I'm starting to zoom out, you can quickly see from a long haul perspective, basically what we talked about at the very beginning, the very, very beginning, the options, but also limited options that do exist, both from a construction standpoint, but physical, mountainous regions are going to prevent the ability to have other routes. So you can see that this slide looks less busy than the metro slide, and that's for obvious reasons. So as you start to think about how to connect to your CSPs, this plays a huge, huge role, because not only your connectivity requirements, but also the requirements of your customers or your vendors or whomever you're providing cloud services for. So as you think about those multi-cloud environments, what we really want to make sure of is we can solve the cloud to cloud, if they're within metro, or even if they're long haul, very easily, very quickly, because a lot of those routes are pre-built. Okay. What takes you time, and it does take us a little bit longer, but we have the tools and the resources and the know-how based on our years of doing this. What we have is a challenge, because in order to connect to your specific location, you're going to have to go into a much more deeper architectural design. And if you're putting a cloud instance to just support your internal consumption, but it's in the wrong location, you think it might be okay, and you haven't really truly evaluated it, that's where you could have some issues with latency and just overall core productivity. And these are the things that we're talking about here, is really just planning the plumbing and designing the architecture. Sounds, like something that's, pretty, kind of pretty, I guess the word I'm looking for is obvious, but it's not that obvious just to the naked eye. And so you really need to understand how to go about this process, utilizing some of the tools and the expertise that does exist. So as we think about our consulting services overview, the first and foremost thing we always provide customers is just a quick free assessment. We've been doing this for 20 years. We've designed and negotiated over 5,000 different contracts, me personally in my career, and have overseen the implementation, the management, and I think that's really important for anybody trying to go to a multi-cloud strategy, or even just a single cloud, redo of your strategy. If you have those environments that you think, geez, I just want to make sure I'm doing this right, because once you move forward and once you start to build these instances, and if that plumbing isn't correct, it can have a disastrous effect on user experience, and it has nothing to do with the actual cloud applications. And we're often having conversations now around redesigning, planned architectures that were going to go forward, and they kind of realize what we can help them with. But also, we've had to redesign existing architectures that, unfortunately, were not, built to suit, and so that's okay. And we never admonish anything like that. We would just want to help. So if you have an environment that you would like us to take a look at, and we can pull up the tools very quickly, no obligations. That's what we're here to do. We get really excited about this, because if we can shave milliseconds down between your applications, if we can improve user experience, if we can help you go to market much faster, and you don't have to worry about the hours that it would take you to figure this out on your own, that's what we're here for. So in closing, hopefully I kept this as short as possible. Please reach out to myself or anyone here on the team at Macronet Services. We'd love to help you. We have more content coming out soon as we kind of build into this, CSP multi-cloud architecture strategy for many customers. So we're going to continue to regurgitate that back to you, so you can take some tips and tricks away, and hopefully that helps your business. So thanks again, and have a great weekend. Take care.